Hi, everyone. Jonathan Alexander here with the Los Angeles Review of Books, and I am just delighted to have as my guest today, Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore, who really has been one of my favorite writers for a long time. I remember reading some time ago the collection That's Revolting, Queer Strategies for Resisting Assimilation. And what I loved about the title, about the collection, was really the title. That's what attracted me to it. That's Revolting. And it's that attraction which actually probably explains a lot about why so many of us are interested in Mattilda's writing. In addition to that book, Mattilda has also edited or written several other volumes, including Nobody Passes, Rejecting the Rules of Gender and Conformity, So Many Ways to Sleep Badly, Why Are Faggots Afraid of Faggots? Flaming Challenges to Masculinity, Objectification, and the Desire to Conform, The End of San Francisco, which was a Lambda Award winner, Sketchtasy, and most recently, the book we're going to talk about today, The Freezer Door, which was just released by Semiotext. Mattilda, thanks so much for talking to me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about this conversation.
Great, thank you. I am too. You know, your book really spoke to me, as I think it might speak to many queer people at this time, about the desire for community, the desire for connection, and some of the difficulties of finding that connection, finding that authentic connection, but also about living a fully embodied life. I would maybe, as a first question, just like to know a little bit about what brought you to this particular book. Why did you write this particular book at this time?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think whenever I start to write a new book, I have no idea what I'm doing. So I just start writing, and then I put everything in one document, sometimes for years, which was the case with this book. And then when I feel like I've arrived somewhere, that's when I'm like, oh, I think I know what this is. And I think that happened after I've been writing for several years. I had hundreds and hundreds of pages of text. And someone in Seattle invited me to do this reading series called The Furnace. And the theme was it had to be writing about Seattle. And I was like, oh, well, this is the writing I have about Seattle. So let me find something from here. And it was just one writer reading for an hour, basically. And I knew the part of this text that I felt was the most formed. And so I pulled from that. And then I pulled from something else that wasn't even connected at first. And that really became the beginning of this book. And so I think what I became aware of was that search, right? You know, that one sort of the landscape in which the book takes place is gentrification, right? So the first, line of the book, it just says, one problem with gentrification is that it always gets worse, right? And that just sits on its own page so that we know that that's where we are. And then there's something that happens in a gay bar where these are spaces that I've avoided for years because I'm like, there's nothing there for me. But I find that I'm very present in everything I already knew, which is the shade and the shame and the sadness, but also there's a sweetness that I realize. And so I kind of realized, oh, the book in a way is a search for that sweetness, for going into spaces that I already know are corrupt in order to find what isn't. And then at the same time, there's a break that happens, early in the book, which is basically when the text can no longer hold. And that's the line where I say, I don't understand why nothing heals. And then the text breaks and goes into a totally different realm, which is a conversation between an ice cube and an ice cube tray. And so at that point, I knew that these are the tensions in the book. It's that search for connection, that search for embodiment, that search for the moment in the city that changes everything, even in these whitewashed, gentrified neighborhoods, in this case in Seattle, but in a broader sense, thinking about everywhere. But in the freezer door, I am talking specifically about Seattle and my life in particular, and sort of circling around all these moments in order to find that possibility to actualize the dream of the city as the place where you find everything and everyone that you never imagined, and those moments of connection that might change everything, even as they often lead to disappointment and devastation.
Exactly. I mean, I think we could just stop there. You've summed it up incredibly. Of course, this really is what I think is speaking to us at this particular time. The sense that we still have these dreams, even though we recognize, especially after coming out of the last 4 years of the previous presidency, we still have these dreams, but we realize how damaged our world is. And that covers many different spaces, many different locales. You say late in the book, I still haven't figured out how to exist with or without gay culture. So even, and for me, some of the most poignant parts of the book were you talking about that difficult relationship with gay culture. On one hand, perhaps a source of refuge, a source of sweetness, a source of comfort, even intimacy. And yet on the other hand, a difficult space full of its own antagonisms, full of its own body fascisms, full of its own gender stereotypes. I'd love to hear anything else you want to say about that, because again, that's part of the book that really resonated with me, a complicated relationship to gay culture.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, growing up as a queer kid who was always persecuted for femininity, who was called faggot and sissy, like way before I had any idea what those things meant. And then when I first entered the world as an avowedly queer person, I moved to San Francisco, I was 19. And I think one of the shocks that I encountered then, when people were like, oh, you should go to this gay neighborhood, the Castro, and you're gonna find everything that you ever dreamed of. And was the shock that gay culture worshipped at the throne of every horrible aspect of masculinity that I despised and that was against my very survival from the beginning. And I think in some ways I've never recovered from that realization. And so my life has been formed in oppositional queer spaces that are opposed both to the violence of dominant straight culture and to the complicity of mainstream gay culture. But in the book, in my life, I have realized that there are queer spaces in which my political analysis is met, in which people understand, gender and transgression, embodied self. And so in the book, in a certain way, is that search for the embodied self. And I think so much of that, there is a lot still of segregation in gay and queer spaces, like based on gender, based on sexuality, based on race, based on class. And in my dream of queerness, it's an end to borders, right? An end to the police. But I think so much of gay culture and of queer culture, even oppositional queer culture, is about policing the borders rather than ending them.
Yeah, and I love how in the book it's very clear that there are at least two dimensions of how I think you're trying to negotiate healing, or at least approaching some of those tensions and splits that you're talking about. And one of them is definitely in the body, in your own relationship to your body and to not just sexuality, just to sex. And one of my favorite passages, if you don't mind my quoting from you here, when I say that finally I'm ready to be a slut again, I mean crossing the line between acceptability and an embodied truth, refusing the boundaries of societal scripts, expressing desire as a form of accountability to myself. I'm ready for laughter to be a part of my sex life. I'm ready for my sex life to be part of my laughter. I'm ready for my sex life to feel like life. This beautiful.
Oh,
Where
thank
are
you.
you, where are you on that journey?
Well, I think in the book, I am really, so I think my sex life has always existed, you know, in many ways in public sexual spaces, right? So parks and alleys and beaches and back rooms. And I'm always in search for that moment of transcendence, right? That moment of connection, that moment where we don't have to worry about the boundaries between ourselves because we can exist in this possibility of desire in the moment, right? And but also those spaces also exist in this zone of especially worship of, again, you know, hypermasculinity and also the worship of silence and of hardness and of lack of care, right? Like I don't want a lack of care. I want to care for everyone I encounter. And I want to always feel like that moment right before I'm about to make out. Like that's what I want to feel like in the world. I want to me, a queer relationship of desire is that it is all the time and everywhere. I want to feel desire when the wind is on my skin or when I'm leaning against a shrub to even out my back or when I'm looking at a stranger across the street or when I'm looking at the light on a building or when I'm on the bus, you know, or when I'm, you know, in my apartment or when I'm, you know, just present, looking at flowers so it's that space of possibility. But I feel like gay culture forecloses that, queer culture forecloses that, Seattle forecloses that, gentrification forecloses that. And so I'm always up against all of that. And I think the book takes place in that tension, right? In that, you know, that impossibility, I would say.
And I love how you track that tension, even that impossibility, at a very granular level, at the level of various friendships, and how you want to be close to people, but it seems like many people don't always know how to be close, how to reciprocate that intimacy. But you also refrain from diagnosing it, because there are probably many reasons why people are either fearful of intimacy or fearful really of continuity in intimacy, which I think is really important. It's an important value in the book. Tell me more about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great point, the continuity of it, right? Because, you know, it's not so hard to find intimacy in the moment. Like getting fucked in the park is not that hard. It's sometimes hard to find, but it's not as hard to find as a friend who will call me back. Even someone who I'm close to, right? And so I feel like so much of our lives has become eroded by this sort of societal script of what relationships do or do not matter, and this consumer mentality where all relationships are disposable unless they fit into this idea of like a long-term committed partnership. And for me, I really want that commitment always. And I don't mean like if I'm having an interaction with someone, I'm like, this is a horrible person. I'm like, get me away. We don't have to have any commitment. But if we believe in one another, I want that continuity. And I do feel like technology has eroded that, assimilation has eroded that, consumer culture has eroded that to such an extent in some ways that people don't even know. You know, they're like, oh, I'll just text you, you know, that's not intimacy. Intimacy is when we can experience ourselves together in the same space, whatever that space is. I mean, now obviously that's complicated, but I still want to move towards that. For me, yeah, I think it's about moving towards, like my queer dreams, which were founded when I moved to San Francisco when I was 19, were that we always, in friendship, you know, and I don't distinguish, I mean, to me, a relationship is a relationship. Sometimes it's sexual, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's romantic, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's political, sometimes it's not. But it's that intimacy that is there and surrounds us, and that we're always building towards revealing more of ourselves, towards more vulnerability. And I think for me, like I'm also working towards that in the text itself. Like I want the text to express the emotion and to shift with the feeling or the not feeling. You know, I don't want something static. You know, I want a kind of vibrancy or vibration or a circling around. You know, I'm searching and the text is also searching for itself. So for me, all of that is a form of embodiment. And I think one thing I realized since finishing the book, in some ways, I think the most successful embodiment in the book is the text itself.
You know, I'm so glad you phrased it that way, because I wanted to ask you a little bit about the style of the book, which similar to many of the other things you've written, but I think I almost want to say amped up in this particular text, because many paragraphs are full of what I would call textual jump cuts. We're going in one direction and then we're going in a different direction, and yet that is not it's not a loss. It might be a momentary interruption, but we always circle back. We keep coming back. And I loved that, although it did take a couple of pages to get used to, but once I was used to it, I was in for it, because I could see that part of what you're doing is following the lead, following the impulse, but underneath all of it was still a deep care for the subjects you were writing about. Does that seem right from your perspective?
Yes, exactly. I think, I mean, I always start, like this book started as this one document. I don't even call it a draft, I just call it the material, but it was 1,000 pages.
Yeah.
And then
Wow.
I'm taking that and like, because the book now it's like 260 pages, but some of those pages are one sentence. So it's like way less than a quarter of the original text. And for me, so I'm editing it really at that granular level, and I edit through voice, and I also edit through, I want it to be condensed into the felt sense, right? So I'm always, the circling around for me is always about that search, right? That search for embodiment or connection, or even a history, or a sense of place, or a world that I can live with. All of that I feel like is always kind of present, and even in the disembodiment, right? Because embodiment, doesn't always involve pleasure. I wish, right? But so I want that all to be, in the text itself.
Yeah, no, it's great, and I think especially as a man of a certain age, having seen so many transformations in the gay community, the queer community, so many different political changes over the last few decades, but especially coming out of the Trump administration, the book kind of ends with these passages on the night of the election, and I'm wondering if you think of this book, or how you think of this book in terms of the Trump presidency, if at all, because there is a politics here.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there is this moment, towards the end of the book, where Trump gets elected, and before he got elected, I was like, Hillary Clinton is the worst thing in the world. So like, I don't know, I wasn't really worried in that sense. But also everyone was just like, Hillary Clinton's getting elected. So everyone was like, oh, okay, it's all. So there was that moment of shock, and that moment where I'm in the park after he gets elected, and I think there's a stray dog coming towards me, and I feel like, oh, that's how I feel. I'm lying on the ground, and I think I'm crying, and then the next day from my window, I hear this protest, and I rush outside. I don't know where it is exactly. And I'm asked, where was that protest? And then I'm following it, and I'm, running down the street, and I finally catch up with it after maybe like 10, 15 blocks. And then we take a bridge, we start to take the highway. And so I feel, and there's this feeling of commonality, like an intense feeling of commonality, even as I also feel a separation, but people are responding to it. People are like, not my president. And I had just seen a post on Twitter by someone named Black Autonomist, and it said, no more presidents. And I was like, no more presidents. And then people were like, yes, no more presidents. And so I felt like in that moment, there's that possibility for connecting with one another in resistance in ways that might not have otherwise been possible. And even in the horrible brutality that we then suffered through, I do feel like certain kinds of radical opposition and protest did become possible that would not have been possible otherwise. And I think what remains to be seen is whether that can survive the Biden presidency, and I feel like that's what happens every time we have another, warmongering neoliberal Democrat, is people are like, oh my God, hooray, progress. Now we don't have to deal with that. They're like, we got Bush out, and then we're like, okay, what's next? Drone bombing, surveillance state, and the same things play out over and over again, right? It's like, did we close Guantanamo yet? No. And it's like, oh, more war, more, and it's just packaged in a different way, right? So people are like, oh, now trans people can go abroad and kill people. Now that Biden's president. So I feel like we're always caught in that trap. And I think that is the nightmare of electoral politics in the US. And in the book, it enters the narrative, but it never becomes central, because it is always a violence that surrounds us. We're living in the dominant colonial power in the world. Like, our lives are predicated on the plunder of the planet, right? So whenever we're living in a horrible time. So we have to make something else possible anyway. And the book is more on the micro level of the body, my body. How can I exist in a world where I feel like my body might finally have a home? And I feel like that's the central question in some ways that I'm asking throughout everything in the book. Throughout talking about, trauma, or talking about surviving sexual abuse, or talking about art, or talking about sexual politics, or getting fucked in the park, or dancing, or chronic pain. All of it is about trying to survive and thrive in a way that feels like there can be a path forward towards connection and not always away from it.
No, it's beautiful. I can't help but ask how the pandemic has been for you, because as you were talking, I realized that as awful as the pandemic has been for so many, there's a weird, I won't call it an irony, but a weird tension, which I think for some of us, it has been a time of really intensification of our intimacies with people, and a real opportunity to show care. I don't want to say that queerness is best when the world is at its worst, which it certainly sometimes feels like that. But I'm wondering if what you're talking about and how this book has emerged for you has helped you through the pandemic, or if some of its lessons, some of its insights have intensified for you during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I wrote the book in what I considered the present, and I imagined that it would come out in a time that I also considered the present. And then 1 year ago, everything changed. And so I thought, what the hell? How are people going to relate to this book? And the thing that has been fascinating, and people were telling me this before it came out, they're like, this is a book for this moment. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. But then it just came out like the end of November. And I feel like what has happened is that the themes in the book of loneliness, of alienation, of the dream of the city, of the toll of gentrification. All of those things have been magnified. And what has happened that I think before, in a way, I think people, not everyone was aware of their loneliness.
Mhm.
And in the time when the book came out, and it still can, now, our current president, everyone's aware of that.
Mhm.
And so the reception for the book has been incredible, and that has really, I have really felt that connection, even though I can't be in the spaces with people. Like I can't have a reading and hug people afterwards. I can't, go on a walk with a friend after a reading to talk about how it went, because my readings are all right here.
Yeah.
Welcome. But I do think the connection with the book itself has been deeper than it would have been otherwise. And that has changed my experience with the world. Like when the pandemic started, I went from maybe having 50% of the touch I want in my life to 0. And it's not that far from 0 now. So I need that connection with my work even more intensely. And so my embodiment is actually even more dependent on that. So I'm thankful that people are connecting with it.
They are, yes. I mean, I think the pandemic really just exacerbated in some ways, or I think for many people made tangible, made all the more real, all of the fault lines, the tensions, the contradictions that riddle our culture. So I have no doubt, that people are connecting with this book. Whom are you reading right now? Can you give us a recommendation for someone that we should be paying more attention to as readers?
Yeah, I just read this amazing book by Anthony Cody. It's called Borderland Apocrypha. And it's a book of poetry, and it's formatted horizontally. And so I knew it had some interesting formatting. And I started it like right before bed, right before I was getting ready for bed. I was like, I'll just read a few pages just to get a sense of the form. And then I couldn't stop. I read the whole thing. And I mean, it's very deep. It's not just a formal experimentation, because it is about, the history of anti-Mexican racism and lynching in the US. And it's explored in this, I think, just a spectacular form. And I think it's rare where the form can unite so much with the purpose and further the potential of the text to disrupt. And I really feel like that book does all of that.
That's great. Thank you. I'll take a look at it for sure. Mattilda, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us. Then thank you for your work, and stay in touch.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Take care.
Bye.